collaboration between product development and the manufacturing supply chain and purchasing people, design for manufacturability, supply chain network optimization, where you look at the whole picture rather than just a little piece and see what you should do. Those are very important. Intel, we won't go into detail, but we did a somewhat similar conference on manufacturing and supply chain with Stanford University, and Intel was kind enough to come there and talk about how they were trying to manage product development, product introductions with supply chain and manufacturing capacities and with the final market. So they're trying to figure out, they realize that despite their very strong position in the market, almost a monopoly position if you like, they also missing a large opportunity because these are not synchronized very well. So they're working heavily on this as we speak. Better visibility. Again, the complexity masters are ahead. Just some of the metrics: distribution, logistics cost, scenario planning, product profitability, custom profitability. In all the areas, the complexity masters are ahead of the other companies. Not necessarily by a very large amount, but if you look at the quadrant 3, if you recall, these are the very complex global companies that didn't have great capabilities. They're clearly punished by a very low visibility. Look, even compared to the base companies that are not as complex down in quadrant 1, the global ones are actually less visibility despite their expansion efforts, and you would think more resources to manage just by their scale and so forth. But clearly there's a penalty to going global without the capabilities in place. Flexibility. We already talked about General Motors. Jeff mentioned that, and he briefly mentioned the GM Celta in Brazil. I think it's just like the Porsche case. The Celta case from an economy car perspective is very interesting. Again, you could say they had a greenfield opportunity. Maybe one of the many beauties of emerging markets is that you're not entrenched in existing capital. You can actually try new things. So with this, they could see, how do we set this up? When they set that up, I think, is Jeff here still? 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more, there was at the time when everybody thought they should build to order. Toyota had announced their 5-day car, and that was the thing. So GM Brazil looked at this and said, well, let's look at the whole thing. What's the right thing to do? So they still use the internet, the hype of the time, but as Jeff said, they were able to build a internet-based model where rather than build to order, you actually build to stock. You know, who would set up a brand new system and build to stock? But the way they looked at it is saying, we can. It's actually more economical in the whole system to build to stock. They then decided to collaborate very heavily with about 500 dealers and involve them in the entire project and in the distribution process. And so they would build a very low variety stock, which then could be compiled behind the dealers in a few distribution centers, and they're able to fill very rapidly the demand from the dealers and the final customers. Dealers they involved to create more variety in the product. They actually have accessorization happening at the dealers. So dealers are very happy. They get to do high value added stuff and build relationship with their customers. The customers are very happy. They can order this online. They can get the configurations they want very fast. Right now I think it's the top 3 or top 4 car in Brazil. It's I think a big success. So it shows that you can play with the whole thing and get some great benefits. I think that the People's Car Tata has announced is a similar thing. Obviously, we'll all see how that plays out in a couple of years. But I think the notion of playing with the idea of working with the dealers and other independents forward in the chain to maybe assemble car or assemble part of the car. Whatever they decide to do. But I think it's very interesting. It's a way of playing with the entire value chain to come up with new configurations that maybe are cheaper and better than existing ones. And almost final here. In terms of collaboration, I already mentioned it, but clearly the complexity masters are way ahead of the other companies. Samsung is a company we've studied a lot in North America. One example where they I think they assumed something was wrong, that they started collaborating very heavily with the top electronics retailer in North America, and by kind of changing the parameters for the collaboration over a 2-year period. We're able to about double the sales through this it's Best Buy. So you can imagine the impact that it has on Samsung overall. This is in consumer electronics, but before and after this, which would seem fairly straightforward. But before that, I think people in Samsung headquarters thought that, well, this relationship is okay. I mean, when you think of it from an outsider, you look at one of the top electronics brands in the world, and you look at the top electronics retail chain in the US, you think, okay, this relationship's got to be good. I mean, I can see the number 10 brand and number 10 retail chain, maybe not so great, but this got to be good. But when they started looking at it, nothing was working, and they went through everywhere from strategy and operational collaboration to using technology, detailers in the stores. One example, 70% of the time, the displays that Samsung's marketing and sales people had invested in were not put up in the store. So you expect that your pricing strategy and your supply chain strategy is going to show up in sales and profitability, but how could it? Because it was not even the final mile, it was the final meter, was not working. So finally, technology. Some has said that IT doesn't matter. It's in global manufacturing, it matters heavily. You see a complexity mass in just about all areas are ahead of the competition in terms of technology. It's not technology by itself. We look at different, for instance, product development. One of the things that really set them apart, I think, is the ability to combine technology and processes. So, but I think without technologies, I think most multinationals will say, if somebody, shut off the electricity from my enterprise systems, the company would come to a halt. And that is definitely true. And you can improve these things, and it matters for your performance. With that, let me turn it over to Kumar, who's going to talk about benchmark in Indian industry.
Good afternoon to all of you. I am thankful to ISB and the other partnering institutions for inviting me to make this presentation. Milind described the meal that we had as the light Indian working lunch. I certainly have no quarrel with Indian and lunch, but light and working, I have problems accepting that. So if your eyelids feel a little heavy, please don't fight them. You'll do me great honor by not snoring loudly. This is not a greatly interesting thing for you to be up and awake. What I would do in the next 15 minutes or so is to talk in the same structure as Peter did about describing the complexity masters. Broadly, we talked about how complexity masters are defined by their ability to create visibility within their supply chains, collaborate extensively with their customers and suppliers, be flexible, adopt technology, and run after innovation. So I'll attempt to talk about how Indian companies are doing this and how good they are and where they're not doing too well. At the outset, let me tell you that we are probably going to talk a little. I am probably going to talk a little bit about the challenges that are facing Indian companies. It's by no means to say that Indian companies are not doing well. They've done tremendous amount of work in some areas, but we probably would end up talking about the challenges a little more. I'm a little scared about talking about the sample size in a room full of academics. You may argue if this is statistically significant, 30 companies in India. We were not really looking for statistical significance at this stage. We wanted to look at sort of a directional movement of processes within organizations. And what I will also say is most of these 30 companies, around 30 companies, are companies that are discussed in the business press and thought of as companies which have mature or reasonably good manufacturing and management practices. So if these companies have certain challenges, you may have to look a little lower to see if the others are going to have similar or greater challenges. And a significant proportion of these 30 companies are from the automotive component sector, which I would like to believe, I'm sure many of you will agree with me, they are part of a fairly mature and evolved supply chain, and if they have sort of exhibited some of the issues that we are going to talk about, it's probably going to be applicable to the other industry sectors as well. So we are careful right through this presentation in saying at this point of time it is probably a little preliminary in nature, the data and the findings that we have, and hopefully next year this time when we come back and make this presentation to you, we'll probably have 60, 100 companies, and the outcomes can be far more conclusive. Some of the interesting things and areas where Indian companies are very different from the global peers is the way they look at what is driving their business. Peter is saying that the global companies think of product innovation, new product revenues as what is going to drive their business for the next 2-3 years. He's talked about how 33-35% of the revenues of these companies are going to come from products which are less than 3 years old. Look at the Indian companies. The way they look at what is going to drive their business seems to be completely different. New product innovation and launch seems to be fairly way down in the pecking order of how they are looking at their immediate future. It's good for Indian companies that there is a booming market, and therefore they probably can get away with this for some time, but every industry sector has got to go through a cycle, and are Indian companies prepared for the downturn when it happens, or are we necessarily looking at the good fortunes that come out because everybody around us is doing well? So this is something that Indian companies may have to look at. This is probably what Dr. M.S. Ananth was talking about yesterday, that the target number for NMCC is going to be 2% of the turnover being spent on research and development. So this is a matter which can cause concern to corporate India. And the issue really is, are we being too passive, or are we allowing things to drift? Do we have a real proactive strategy to counter what's going to happen in the next 2-3 years? In terms of, as you would have seen here, they're talking about entering new geographic markets as a business driver for themselves. So we spoke to these companies, and we find that very interestingly, while everybody in India talks about China as a competitor, they also want to go to China in a big way. Everybody wants to go and sell in China. They want to go and source from China, manufacture in China, and interestingly even engineer in China. And the green band, which is other Southeast Asia, is primarily Thailand, with whom we have a free trade agreement. So Indian companies are looking at going all over the place. But when we took back the benchmark report to all these companies, and we talked around how they are preparing for this movement, very interestingly, a number of them came and said, look, the biggest problem we have when we talk about geographic expansion is we don't have an organization structure. Unlike IT companies, which over the period of the last couple of decades have developed a fairly competent international managerial pool, most of the manufacturing companies, the mid-sized ones particularly, seem to be having problems of identifying who's going to go and run the manufacturing operation in China or the sourcing operation in Thailand. They have fantastic engineers, but they don't have an understanding of, let's say, finance, or they don't have an understanding of how to run an independent entity in a different geography or in a different culture. So very interestingly, some of them were telling us that we are postponing our decision to set up shop in a particular country because we don't have our own man who can go represent this company and start up operations there. And culturally, manufacturing companies seem to be extremely reluctant to pull somebody from another company from some other country and probably give them the responsibility to go and do things in a new place. So this is some sort of a disconnect between what they want to do in their strategy and what they're trying to do in their day-to-day operations and in their supply chains. And The third thing is they're all doing well in terms of growth at a gross profit level. But if you really look at the cost of finance and so forth, at a net profit level, it's a different matter as to how much they would take back home. Very interestingly, again, many of the companies that are in the database just now are substantially owned by Indian promoters. It varies anywhere up from 40% to 60-65%, which means that portion of the equity has to be serviced at a fairly high level. Therefore, it's at a gross level it seems okay, but are they really being profitable in comparison with the other global companies? One area where companies are doing exceedingly well is in the area of quality. As I think Anant was saying in the morning, there are Deming Prize winners in India, Japanese quality medal winners, and so forth. What is also interesting is there are clusters certainly around automotive components and probably life sciences and pharmaceutical, where even though